It's the Monday after the Matric dance. Lerato is furious because her best friend Butle spent the entire evening dancing with Sipho, the boy Lerato liked. Instead of confronting Butle, Lerato posts this on her Instagram story without mentioning any names. Some people smile in your face then stab you in the back for a boy who wasn't even worth it. By the next morning, the entire grade 12 WhatsApp group is buzzing. Everyone knows exactly who the post is about, even though Lerato never mentions Butle by name. What is implied by Lerato's story? A weak answer which gets 0 would be, someone smiled in her face and stabbed her in the back for a boy. That simply repeats the post. The post really implies that Lerato feels betrayed by Butle and is using social media to publicly call her out without confronting her directly. The correct way to answer is to use your own words and specify who, what, and when. So the answer should be, this implies that Lerato feels betrayed by Butle, whom she believes pursued Sipho at the Matric dance despite knowing Lerato liked him, and she is using a public post rather than a private conversation to publicly embarrass Butle without naming her directly. Notice that in the answer there is no someone, smile in your face, no stab you in the back, no boy, but the who, Lerato and Butle, the what, the fallout over Sipho, and the when or where, the Matric dance that same night, are all spelled out using context clues, exactly like reading a historical source. Now that you have seen how implied meaning works in everyday life, let's see how the DBE tests exactly the same skill in history. Notice that the wording changes, but the thinking process never does. Examiners use different command words, but they are really testing one skill, reading between the lines, to work out what is not directly stated. Here is what those command words mean. Implied means the writer never says it directly, so you must work out the unstated point behind the words. Signified means what a specific word, symbol, or action stood for in that context. Meant means the real intention or message the writer or speaker wanted to get across. Suggests means the direction the evidence points toward, even if it is not stated as a fact. Indicates means a specific clue in the source that points you towards an answer. Infer means the judgment you reach by connecting the clues in the source with your own knowledge. Conclusion, or what can be deduced, means the final reasoned judgment you arrive at after weighing up all the evidence together. So although the wording changes, the thinking process stays the same. Find the hidden meaning, then state it in your own words, and specify when, who, what exactly is being talked about. That is why implied, signified, and meant all deal with what the source is doing behind the scenes. Suggests and indicates tell you where the evidence is pointing. Infer and conclusion are about what you, the reader, must do with that evidence. All of them lead to the same answer method. Hidden meaning, own words, specific evidence. The big question behind every one of them is this: what is the source indirectly telling me? This is different from an extraction question, where the examiner wants you to quote evidence word for word. In implied meaning questions, copying the source is one of the quickest ways to lose marks. Many learners simply repeat the words they see, but the examiner wants what is hidden behind the words, not the words themselves. So use this method. Do not repeat the quoted words. If the source says trips to Berlin are over, your answer must not repeat the words trips or Berlin. You must explain the idea behind it. Explain the hidden idea behind the quoted words in your own words. Always be specific. Do not give a vague statement. Name the people, groups, events, or dates involved. Add evidence from your own knowledge. That means naming exactly who, what, when, and where is being referred to. That level of detail is what takes an answer from weak to strong. In short, say the same thing as the quoted statement, but in your own words, without repeating the source, while also showing exactly what or who you are referring to. Before answering any implied, signified, meant, suggest, infer, or conclude question, always ask yourself, what is the source indirectly telling me? Have I avoided repeating the source's exact wording? Have I named a specific person, group, event, or date rather than speaking vaguely? Does my answer show judgment, not just description? Questions from the November 2024 DBE history examinations are used throughout this tutorial as worked examples. As you work through these questions, do not memorize the answers. Instead, watch how each answer follows the same three-step method. Find the hidden meaning, rewrite it in your own words, and strengthen it with specific historical evidence. We begin with paper 1. Let us start with question 1.2.2 that asks you to comment on what is implied by the words "It's all over now with trips to Berlin" in the context of what happened on the 13th of August 1961. The speaker is not just talking about travel. The statement reveals that the border has been closed and that normal movement between the two sides of the city has ended. It also shows that Germany is becoming more deeply divided during the Cold War. So the statement implies that families, workers, and visitors can no longer move freely between the communist German Democratic Republic and the capitalist sectors controlled by Britain, France, and the United States after the border was sealed and construction of the Berlin Wall began. Another way of saying it is that the Soviet-backed authorities had permanently divided the city in order to stop East Germans from escaping to the West, which showed that Cold War tensions had become much worse. The key thing to notice is that neither answer repeats the phrase "trips to Berlin are over." Instead, each answer explains the exact meaning behind the official's words. That is, ordinary movement between East and West had ended. Next is 1.4.3, the question about the various ways in which the East Berliners tried to reach the Western sector. The question reads, what conclusions can be drawn from the fact that Nofke and a group were prepared to dig a tunnel of 200 yards to smuggle their families to the West? The examiner is not asking you to list the escape methods. Instead, you must explain what those desperate attempts reveal about life under communist rule. The answer is that many East Berliners believed that staying under communist government offered them little hope of political freedom or a better standard of living. That is why they were willing to risk danger in order to reach West Berlin. It also shows that the Berlin Wall did not destroy people's desire for a better future. Even after the wall was built, many East Germans were still willing to risk imprisonment or death because they believed life in the West offered greater opportunity. So do not describe the tunnels, fences, or methods. Explain what those actions reveal about people's attitude towards life in East Germany. Then comes question 1.5.2 based on the sign on the Western sector side that says "Defectors welcome." The question instructs us to comment on the implication of the message on the signpost on the Western sector side, "Defectors welcome." The sign is not simply giving information, it is trying to persuade East Germans that leaving communist rule for the West is the better choice, while also exposing the weakness of the German Democratic Republic. The statement implies that the Western governments wanted East Germans to abandon communism and settle in the democratic sectors, using each successful escape as proof that capitalism offered a better future than life under the German Democratic Republic. It also suggests that life under capitalism offered greater political freedom and economic opportunity, and that East Germans should move permanently to the Western sector. Again, notice that the answer does not repeat the slogan. It explains what the sign is trying to achieve. What conclusion can you draw from the body language of the two generals in the foreground, in the context of defections? The examiner is not asking you to describe how the generals look. You must explain what their postures reveal about the growing number of East Germans. The answer is that the cartoon suggests East German leaders had realized they were losing public confidence because despite building the Berlin Wall in August 1961, increasing numbers of citizens were still risking their lives to escape. It also indicates that communist authorities could no longer stop determined residents from leaving the German Democratic Republic, showing the growing weakness of their government during the Berlin crisis. What matters here is not the appearance of the generals, but what their body language represents: frustration and helplessness. The Berlin Wall examples focused mainly on political intention and propaganda. Now we move to another topic where the hidden meaning lies beneath historical statements and diplomatic events. First is question 2.1.3, which is asking you to explain the significance of Angola's air superiority during the Battle of Quito Cuanavao. The examiner is not asking you to define air superiority or simply say that Angola controlled the skies. You must explain why that mattered and how it influenced the battle. That is why the key word is significance. Ask yourself, why was this important? What difference did it make? How did it influence the outcome? One possible answer is that it enabled MPLA and the Cuban forces to defend Quito Cuanaval more effectively by limiting the South African Defense Force's ability to launch successful air attacks and support its ground troops. Another possible answer is that Angola's control of the air shifted the military advantage to MPLA and Cuban forces, contributing to the withdrawal of the South African Defense Force and helping create conditions that eventually led to negotiations in Southern Africa. The point is that air superiority was not just a fact. It changed the military situation and had wider political consequences. The next question, 2.1.4, which requests you to comment on what is implied by the statement, it was important in Southern Africa that white South Africans could be killed by bullets fired by black Africans and black Cubans in the context of the Angolan War. The statement is not really about who shot who. It highlights the collapse of the belief that apartheid South Africa's armed forces could not be defeated. So the statement implies that the battle destroyed the idea that apartheid's military was unbeatable, giving liberation movements across Southern Africa new confidence that white minority rule could eventually be defeated. It also shows that apartheid South Africa could no longer dominate the region militarily, creating conditions that helped Namibia achieve independence and encouraged negotiations across Southern Africa. The focus here is on the psychological and political effect of the battle, not the race of the people involved. Next is 2.3.2, a question about the significance of the presence of the United Nations Secretary General at the signing of the Tripartite Accord. The examiner is not asking you to identify the Secretary General. You must explain what his presence revealed about the importance of the agreement. His presence suggests that the peace agreement had international support and that the global community regarded the negotiations as an important step towards ending regional conflict. It also indicates that the United Nations wanted to give the agreement international legitimacy and encourage all the governments involved to honor their commitments after the years of military confrontation. So the attendance of the Secretary General represented recognition, legitimacy, and importance. Then comes 2.5.2, which questions what was implied by Mandela's statement that the battle was of truly historic significance. The examiner is not asking you to repeat the phrase historic significance. You must explain why Mandela saw the battle as such a major turning point. The answer is that the battle marked an important turning point for Angola, Cuba, and the wider liberation struggle because it weakened apartheid South Africa's military dominance in the region and increased pressure for political change. It also showed that the apartheid government could no longer force its military will on neighboring states, creating favorable conditions for Namibian independence and later constitutional negotiations within South Africa. So the battle was historically important because of its wider political consequences. You have now seen how implied meaning works in Cold War history. The same skill is tested again in the civil rights movement. The historical context changes, but the thinking process stays the same. Question 3.1.3 asks, who do you think are referred to as evil persons who are determined to smear the march and to discredit the cause of equality by deliberate efforts with regards to the preparations for the March on Washington in 1963? This is one of the indirect ways the DBE tests implied meaning. The examiner is asking you to infer who is being spoken about from the context. The answer is that this refers to organizations and individuals who opposed equal rights for African Americans, such as segregationist politicians and white supremacist groups who wanted to undermine support for the demonstration by provoking disorder. It could also refer to extremist organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan, whose history of intimidation and racial violence made organizers fear that they might disrupt the event and damage the reputation of the civil rights movement. The important thing is not to repeat the phrase evil persons. The examiner wants you to identify who they were. The next question, 3.1.4, asks you to comment on the implication of the statement. We ask each and every one to place the cause above all else. The examiner is not asking you to repeat the instruction. Instead, explain why the organizers appealed for unity and discipline. The statement suggests that the organizers wanted everyone taking part in the demonstration to remain united and disciplined so that opponents would not be able to portray the campaign for equal rights as violent or disorganized. It also implies that personal disagreements between the civil rights organizations had to be put aside so that the march could present one clear demand for an end to racial discrimination across the United States. So the hidden message is unity, discipline, and self-control. The next question is 3.2.3 and asks you to explain the significance of the presence of many leaders from various fields who were allowed to address the marchers. The examiner is not asking you to identify the leaders or list the different fields they came from. The key word is significance. Ask yourself, why was this important? What did it achieve? What does it tell us about the event? One possible answer is that it showed that the March on Washington had widespread support from different sections of American society. If leaders from religious, political, labor, and civil rights organizations all participated, that suggests support for the march went beyond one organization. It shows broad public support, which made the march a major national event. Another possible answer is that the presence of many leaders strengthened the civil rights movement by presenting a united front in the fight for equality. When influential leaders stand together and speak with one voice, it shows unity and cooperation. That strengthened the message of the march and increased its influence on both the public and the government. So do not focus on who the leaders were. Focus on why their presence mattered. The last question in this section, 3.2.4, asks you to comment on why the I Have a Dream speech may be regarded as historically significant. The examiner is not asking you to describe the speech or repeat what Martin Luther King Jr. said. You must explain why the speech is historically important and what lasting impact it had on the civil rights movement and American history. The speech is historically significant because it inspired millions of people to support the struggle for civil rights and racial equality. It was delivered at the March on Washington, one of the most important events in the civil rights movement. Because it inspired support for equal rights and strengthened the movement, its importance lies in the influence it had on society. Another possible answer is that the speech became a symbol of the fight against racial discrimination and helped build support for the civil rights reforms. It became one of the best-known speeches in history and is still remembered because it strengthened the campaign for equality. The reasoning process for significance questions is simple. Spot the command word, translate it into plain English. Look for the impact or lasting importance in the source and your own knowledge, then write the answer. Use this approach for every significance question you meet in DBE history papers. The examiner strip in this section is worth remembering. Every answer should avoid copying the wording in the source. Explain the hidden meaning rather than just describing what happened, and support the inference with specific historical evidence such as the Ku Klux Klan, segregationists, the March on Washington, non-violent protests, civil rights organizations, and the campaign for equal rights. That is exactly what DBE markers reward, because it shows historical interpretation rather than simple paraphrasing. Paper 2 tests exactly the same interpretation skills you have been practicing in Paper 1. The topics have changed, but the examiner still expects you to identify the hidden meaning, explain it in your own words, and support it with relevant historical knowledge. Let us begin with 1.1.4, the question that asks you to comment on what is implied by the statement. Addressing these bread and butter issues automatically drove them, that is the civil rights organizations, to political issues in their townships. The examiner is not asking you to explain what bread and butter issues are. Instead, ask yourself, what does this statement suggest? What can I infer from it? What idea is the author trying to communicate without saying it directly? The answer is that organizations such as the Alexandria Action Committee initially focused on improving everyday living conditions, but soon realized that lasting solutions were impossible without challenging apartheid laws and local government structures. It also indicates that residents who joined community organizations to deal with the problems like poor housing and rising rents gradually became involved in resisting apartheid because government policies had caused those hardships. So the hidden idea is that community problems and apartheid politics were closely connected. Since those problems came from apartheid government policies, anyone trying to solve them would eventually have to challenge the government itself. That is why the statement implies that community action naturally developed into political resistance. Do not rewrite the statement. Think about the hidden meaning behind it. 2.2.3 is the next question, which asks you to comment on the meaning of the statement. If you were really remorseful, you wouldn't apply for amnesty, but in fact, stand trial for what you did. Regarding Coetzee's request for forgiveness, the examiner is not asking you to repeat the statement. Instead, explain what it reveals about the speaker's view of Dirk Coetzee's application for amnesty. The statement implies that Imran Musa believed Dirk Coetzee was trying to avoid criminal punishment rather than genuinely accepting responsibility for the murder of Sizwe Kondile. It also suggests that real regret would have meant accepting prosecution through the courts instead of relying on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to escape a criminal sentence. So the speaker's judgment is that Coetzee was not being sincere. The statement shows suspicion and criticism, and it suggests that the amnesty application was driven by self-interest rather than remorse. The next question is 3.1.5. It asks you to explain the meaning of the statement. South Africa is relatively open to trade in the context of globalization. The key words are explain the meaning of the statement, so do not repeat the phrase. Explain the idea behind it in your own words. The statement means that South Africa allows businesses from other countries to enter its market and operate with few restrictions. It also means that South Africa participates in the global economy by encouraging trade and economic cooperation with other countries. In other words, the country is connected to international trade, which makes it attractive to foreign businesses. The question teaches an important exam technique. Do not repeat the statement, and do not define just one word from it. Instead, ask yourself, what is the hidden idea? What is the author really saying? How can I express that idea in my own words? The next question, 3.2.2, asks you to comment on the meaning of the words Walmart, the economic colonizer. The examiner is not asking you to define the word colonizer. Instead, explain what the poster is suggesting about Walmart's impact on South Africa. The slogan suggests that Sakau believed Walmart's takeover of Massmart would allow a powerful foreign corporation to benefit at the expense of South African workers, suppliers, and businesses, much like colonial powers once enriched themselves through control of African economies. It also implies that the merger could increase foreign control over South Africa's retail sector, reducing opportunities for local producers while allowing wealth generated in the country to benefit overseas interests. Again, the key is not to repeat the slogan, but to explain the comparison being made. Use historical evidence such as Sakau, Walmart, Massmart, South African producers, and colonial economic exploitation. By now, you should have noticed that every question, whether it asks you about what is implied, meant, suggested, indicated, inferred, or concluded, uses the same thinking process. First, work out what the examiner is really asking. Second, explain the hidden meaning in your own words. Third, support your answer with specific historical evidence. Once you stop copying the source and start explaining what it really reveals, you are answering at the level expected of a high-achieving grade 12 history learner. There is one last trap to watch out for. Many learners think that they are using their own words, but they are really just swapping one or two words while keeping the sentence almost the same. For example, if the source says defectors welcome, do not say people escaping were welcomed. That is still recycling the source. A better answer would be, the Western authorities wanted East Germans to abandon communist rule because it exposed the weaknesses of the German Democratic Republic. That is the kind of explanation the examiner wants.